At my only son's wedding, they seated me at a small table by the kitchen doors, next to the waiter's station, and when I asked if there'd been a mistake, the bride's mother leaned down and whispered that I wasn't really needed up front. I want you to understand where I was sitting when she said it. Not at the head table, where the parents of the couple are supposed to sit. Not even at the second table, or the third. I was at the very back of that beautiful ballroom, at a little two-top wedged beside the swinging doors where the servers came in and out with their trays, close enough that I had to move my chair every time one of them passed. There was a folded place card on the table with my name on it in gold script, Patricia Donnelly, as if calligraphy could make a back table into an honor. I'd worn my best dress, lavender. I'd had my hair done that morning. I was the mother of the groom. And Bianca Preston, the mother of the bride, in a gown that cost more than my monthly pension, bent down close to my ear so no one else could hear, and she said, "I hope you understand, Patricia. It's a formal event, and the front tables are really for the people who are part of things. You're not really needed up front, just enjoy the evening. You're not really needed up front. I want you to sit with that for a second. Not welcome, not wanted, just not needed. As if the whole day were a machine, and I was a part that didn't fit. And I did not cry. I did not make a scene at my son's wedding, which is the one thing I would never do, not in 1,000 years, not if they'd sat me in the parking lot. I did not tell Bianca Preston that I was the reason there was a wedding in that ballroom at all. I looked at the little gold place card, and I picked it up, and I set it back down, and I smiled at her, and I said 3 words. Of course, thank you. Then I sat down at the waiter's table, and I folded my hands in my lap, and I watched my son marry the woman he loved from 60 feet away, past the centerpieces and the chandeliers, and the backs of 200 strangers. What Bianca Preston didn't know what she had never once thought to ask. Because she'd decided the moment she met me that a widow in a lavender dress from a lavender dress kind of life couldn't possibly matter was that there was an envelope. An envelope I didn't even know existed. And in about 20 minutes, the officiant was going to open it in front of every single person in that room. But to understand why I smiled and sat down, and why I had no idea yet that the whole evening was about to turn, you have to go back. You have to understand who I was to my son, and what I'd quietly done to put him in that ballroom, and how a mother lets herself be seated by the kitchen doors and says thank you. My name is Patricia Donnelly. Everyone calls me Pat. I was 61 years old the night I was seated with the waiters at my son's wedding, and for most of my life I believed something that turned out not to be true. I believed that love meant never needing to be thanked, that if you truly loved someone, you gave quietly, you asked for nothing, and you certainly never mentioned what it cost you. I thought keeping score was the opposite of love. It took me until I was 61, at a two-top by the kitchen doors, to understand that giving in total silence had taught the loud people in the room that I'd given nothing at all. My husband Frank died when David was 19, a heart attack, no warning, gone before the ambulance reached the house. David was in his 2nd year of college, and I remember sitting him down and telling him we'd find a way to keep him there, because his father would have wanted it, and because that boy was the whole of my heart. Frank had been a union electrician. I did the books for a plumbing company. We were not poor, but we were not the Prestons, not by several zip codes. After Frank died, I worked, and I took in extra bookkeeping on weekends, and I made sure David finished school without a mountain of debt on his shoulders. I did it quietly. I never once let him see me count the pennies. That was the whole point. David grew up good. I say that as his mother, but I'd say it about a stranger's son if it were true he grew up kind, and hardworking, and steady, the kind of man his father would have been proud of. He became an engineer, and a few years ago, he met Ashley Preston. I want to be honest, because I made mistakes too, and this story isn't worth telling if I'm not honest about them. I liked Ashley at first. She was bright and lovely and she clearly adored my son. Her family was another matter, but I told myself that was just my own insecurity. The Prestons had money, real money, the kind that's been sitting still for a couple of generations. Bianca Preston ran charity galas. Gerald Preston golfed with people whose names are on buildings. And from the very first dinner, they had a way of looking at me kind, on the surface, but with a little tilt of the head, the way you look at someone's sweet old dog. I told myself a lot of things back then. I told myself they didn't mean it. I told myself the little comments. Oh, how resourceful of you, Patricia, when I mentioned I'd made David's christening gown myself. It must have been so hard on your own were kindly meant. Every time I smoothed it over, every time I laughed along, I taught them that there would be no cost to condescending to me. Kindness without a boundary isn't kindness. It's a welcome mat you keep laying down for people who wipe their feet on it. When David and Ashley got engaged, the wedding planning began, and I watched myself get managed gently and completely right out of it. Bianca took charge, which is a phrase that sounds generous until you realize it means someone else's opinions have been quietly retired. My suggestions were received with a warm "we'll certainly consider that" and never spoken of again. The venue was chosen without me. The date, the colors, the menu. I was told, more than once, not to worry about a thing. I understand now that "don't worry about a thing" and "you're not needed" are the same sentence wearing different clothes. But here is the part that matters most, the thing that became the whole story. About 8 months before the wedding, David called me one evening, and I could hear in his voice that something was wrong. It came out slowly. The venue, the grand one Bianca had chosen, the one Ashley had fallen in love with, required a large, non-refundable deposit to hold the date, and there'd been a misunderstanding about who was paying for what. The Prestons, it turned out, had been happy to plan a lavish wedding but assumed the couple would cover the venue themselves, and David and Ashley, just starting out, did not have that kind of money sitting around. They were about to lose the date. Ashley was heartbroken. And my son, my proud, good son, was calling his widowed mother not to ask for anything he would never, but just because he needed to tell someone, and I was the someone he'd always told. So, I paid it, the deposit, quietly. It was a great deal of money for me, most of what I'd set aside, the cushion I'd spent 20 years building for my own old age. I didn't have to think about it for even a moment. I called the venue the next morning, gave them my card, secured the date, and I asked them to keep it between us. I told David only that it had been taken care of. Don't ask how, just be happy. I didn't want him carrying the weight of what it cost me, and I didn't want the Prestons to feel awkward. And this is the mistake. The real one. I believed, the way I always believed, that the truth would simply take care of itself. That doing the right thing quietly was its own reward, and needed no witness. I kept the receipt. I don't even know why. Habit, I suppose, from all those years doing other people's books. I put it in a drawer and forgot about it. That receipt, it turns out, was the thread that unraveled everything. Because my son, it turned out, is his father's boy, and he doesn't let a loose thread lie. Months later, sorting through some paperwork at my house while I was out, David found that receipt. And he understood, in one glance, exactly what his mother had done, and had never mentioned, and had let the Prestons take credit for at every turn. And my David, I didn't know any of this yet. Remember, I only learned it later. My David did not confront anyone. He did something quieter and far more devastating. He waited, and he made a plan of his own. So let me take you back to that ballroom, to the moment after I said, of course, thank you, and sat down by the kitchen doors, because that thank you was not surrender. Something in me had gone very still. Not angry. I've never been much for anger. It was the stillness of a woman who has just been shown, in front of 200 people, exactly where a certain kind of person believes she belongs, and who decides, in the same breath, that she is not going to let it ruin the one thing that actually matters, watching her boy be happy. I resolved to sit at that table with my back straight and my chin up, to clap when everyone clapped and to be glad, genuinely glad, because my son was getting married, and no seating chart could take that from me. I watched the ceremony from the back. It was beautiful. And when it came time for the vows and the blessing, the officiant, a warm-faced man the couple had chosen themselves, did something that wasn't in any program I'd seen. He said, before I pronounce them, the groom has asked me to read something aloud. He wrote it himself, and he asked that it be a surprise, even to the person it concerns. And he took out an envelope. I didn't think anything of it. I assumed it was a note to his bride. I was reaching for my water glass, and then the officiant began to read, and the first words were, "This is for my mother." I put the glass down. He read my son's letter to that entire room, in a clear, steady voice, and I am going to tell you what it said, as near as my memory can hold it, Because I have read the copy David gave me afterwards so many times I nearly know it by heart. He wrote, "Most of you don't know the woman sitting at the small table in the back of this room. Her name is Patricia Donnelly, and she is my mother. My father died when I was 19, and she raised me the rest of the way alone, on a bookkeeper's salary and more love than one person should be able to hold. She never let me see her struggle. I only found out later how many weekends she worked so I could stay in school. She taught me what it means to give without being asked, and to give without being seen." The room had gone very quiet. I could feel 200 faces beginning to turn, slowly, toward the back. He went on, "8 months ago, Ashley and I almost lost this venue. We couldn't cover the deposit, and we were too proud and too embarrassed to say so out loud. And someone paid it, quietly, anonymously. They asked that it never be mentioned. I only found out by accident, months later, when I found the receipt in a drawer at her house." His voice, the officiant's, caught a little here, reading it. "My mother spent nearly everything she had saved for her own old age so that Ashley and I could stand in this room today. And then she said nothing, and let others take the credit, and never once asked for a thing in return. That is who paid for this wedding. That is who has been sitting at the back, by the kitchen doors, in a lavender dress, so as not to be a bother." I heard someone gasp. I heard a chair scrape. And then David set down the microphone he'd apparently been ready with, and he walked down the aisle, past the head table, past the Prestons, all the way to the back of that room, and he held out his hand to me, and he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Mom, you are not sitting back here. You have never once in your life been at the back of anything that mattered to me. Come sit where you belong." I want to tell you about Bianca Preston's face in that moment, because I had a clear view of it as my son led me up the aisle, and I won't pretend, as much as I try to be a good woman, that I felt nothing. I watched the certainty drain out of her face the way water drains from a sink. She had spent months arranging every detail to make sure the world saw the Prestons as the family that mattered, and in the space of one letter, in front of everyone whose opinion she'd been performing for, the truth had simply surfaced. Plainly, undeniably. There was no arguing with a receipt read aloud at an altar. They sat me at the head table. David pulled out the chair himself. And the rest of that evening, I was not the widow by the kitchen doors. I was the mother of the groom, the woman 200 people now knew had quietly given nearly everything so that this day could happen. People I'd never met came up to me all night. An older gentleman took my hand and said, "Ma'am, you raised a fine man." And I thought, yes, I did. That was the one thing I'd never doubted. Now, the consequences, and here is where I want to be careful, because this channel is not about revenge, and neither am I. I never said a cross word to Bianca Preston. I didn't have to. My son's letter had said everything, and the plain truth had done what no argument ever could. The Prestons spent the rest of the evening in a strange, deflated quiet. Their performance had nothing left to stand on. Bianca never apologized to me. The closest she ever came, weeks later, was a stiff note that said she regretted any confusion about the seating, which is not the same thing, and we both knew it. But the whole extended family, both sides, had seen, and you cannot unsee a thing like that. She had built her standing on looking down at people like me, and she'd done it, out loud, at the exact moment the truth was about to be read from an altar. She undid herself. All I'd done was buy a venue deposit and keep quiet, and all my son had done was refuse to let the quiet stand. Not everyone stayed on the wrong side of it, because the aftermath is never as clean as we'd like. Ashley, my new daughter-in-law, came to find me later that night, and there were tears in her eyes, and she said, "I didn't know. I swear to you, Pat, I didn't know they'd put you back there, and I didn't know what you'd done for us. I'm so ashamed of my family, and so grateful for you." And I believed her, because she was Ashley, not a Preston in the ways that mattered. We're close now, she and I. She calls me on Sundays. When their first child was born 3 years later, they named her Frances, after my Frank, and they asked me to be there in the room. I was not at the back of that room either. I was right up front, holding my granddaughter first. I have a real place at that family's table now. Not because I demanded one, and not because of a letter, but because my son made sure, in front of everyone, that the truth of who I was could never be seated by the kitchen doors again. Here is what I know now. And it's the only thing I really came here to tell you. Love is not a line on a seating chart. The people who count loudly, who measure everything in money and appearances, and who deserves the front table, they will always place the quiet givers last. Because they mistake silence for insignificance. For most of my life I believed that giving without being seen was the purest kind of love, and in a way it is. But I learned something hard that night. Giving in total silence doesn't make your love invisible to the people who matter. It only makes it invisible to the people who never looked. My son looked. He found a receipt in a drawer, and he understood everything, because I'd raised him to see the people other people overlook. And that's the other thing, the one I most want you to carry. The quiet things you do for the people you love are never really lost, even when no one thanks you, even when someone else takes the credit, even when you're seated at the back by the kitchen doors. They're written somewhere, not in a will, not on a chart in a person, in the character of a child you raised right. My worth was never going to be assigned by Bianca Preston's seating plan. It had already been recorded, years before, in the kind of man my son became, and a man like that will always, eventually, walk to the back of the room and take your hand. The people who seat you last because they think you don't matter are only telling you they never once looked closely enough to know you. But somebody did. Somebody always does. So, let me leave you with a question, because I read every single comment and I want to know. If you had given nearly everything you had, in silence, and then been seated at the back of your own child's wedding and told you weren't needed up front, would you have smiled and said thank you and sat down the way I did? Or would you have stood up right then and said exactly what you'd done? There's no wrong answer. I've made my peace with mine. But I'd truly like to hear yours. Tell me in the comments below. And if this story stayed with you, if you know what it is to give quietly, and be placed last by people who count loudly, then stay with me. Because the next story I'm going to tell you is about a woman whose sister-in-law returned every single gift she'd ever given the family, in a box on her porch, and then asked for the one thing that wasn't hers to ask for. What I did with that box is something I still think about. Watch that one next. Subscribe to Aveline Justice. New stories every single day, and every one of them, like this one, is for anyone who ever gave in silence and was placed at the back of the room. Because the truth, it always finds its way to the surface. I'm Pat, thank you for sitting with me. I'll see you in the next one.